Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pharmacometrics Africa Uganda chapter webinar. And it's great to see such a large audience already. We could see even at five to the hour, we were already having a number of participants waiting. And I know that a number of you have signed up. Today, we have chosen a topic that we thought would be really helpful for both people involved in modelling themselves, but also for perhaps some of our clinical colleagues who need to make decisions looking at model data, maybe regulators, maybe ethics committees, trying to demystify some of the approaches, because it's all very well to be able to do modelling, but we need to be able to communicate about what we've done, why it matters, what it means, and why you can trust it. So this is why we've invited Aida Kawuma to give today's presentation. I know that many of you do know Aida. Aida is a postdoctoral pharmacokinetic modeler. She has several different roles. She's a consultant for Pumas-AI. She's a lecturer at Makerere University in Kampala, and she's a postdoctoral researcher with the maternal and infant lactation pharmacokinetics team. So again, she could give a very fascinating seminar on career options in modelling, but that might be something you can reach out to her for separately. But she juggles these multiple roles. And what really brings it all together is her gift and her passion for communicating and for teaching. So in terms of how today is going to be structured, I'm going to hand over to Aida. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see there is both a chat, but there's also a Q&A button. If you are able to use the Q&A to put your questions, because it just makes it easier to separate them out. But I will be watching both the Q&A and the chat. You can ask questions as you go along and we can deal with them at the end, or you can wait to the end with your questions. But I would like to encourage you that this webinar is for you. There is no such thing as a stupid question. So I hope you learned something. Aida, you are most welcome.
Thank you so much, Katrina, for such a warm introduction. Can you confirm that you can hear and see me?
I can.
Okay, so I'll share my slides next.
Wonderful. And then pop them on. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
So thank you so much for inviting me under Pharmacometrics Africa. So I'm going to take you through a session on communicating population PK/PD modeling results with clarity. So I do not claim to be an expert at all. What I'm going to share here today is some tips that I've gleaned over the years as a population pharmacokinetic modeler. So one takeaway message that I want to start straight away with is that the audience determines the approach you use to communicate your results. It will determine what you show, how you word it, and what you leave out. So if you don't take away anything from this talk, please just take away the one message, which is that the audience will always determine your approach. And we're going to go through what that audience looks like. That audience might be a manuscript where you're targeting scientists. These may be technical scientists who have in-depth knowledge, or it might simply be some scientists who have a bit of understanding of what you do, but are not technical experts. That audience might be to students, it might be to clinicians, it might be to regulators, it might be to ethics review boards. Whatever it is, I want you to go away knowing that the audience really determines the approach you use to communicate. So before we start, I have some disclosures. So AI was used in preparing this slide deck. I used some generative AI tools to, do a bit of formatting. And then also the views expressed here are my own. They are not necessarily those of Pumas-AI or any other organization I'm affiliated with. The examples I use are drawn from publicly available resources, and I cite all of them at the end. And therefore, there's no confidential or proprietary data that is presented anywhere in this slide deck. So I'm sure most of you are initiated, but for those who are not, what is population pharmacokinetic modeling? Well, as opposed to individual pharmacokinetic, an individual, population pharmacokinetic modeling simply means that you're bunching together a group of individuals. Usually we have concentration time data. So you can see this is a drug known as dolutegravir used for the treatment of HIV, and we have some concentration time data. And so we have a profile of several individuals. So population pharmacokinetic modeling simply means we fit all these individuals, we model their profiles as we fit a typical profile to them and estimate some variability around that. But simply, that is what it means very vaguely in terms for what population pharmacokinetic modeling is. So as opposed to doing it individually, we pull individuals together and fit a single model. So why am I giving this talk today? Why do we feel the need to give this talk? So really, when we are doing population PK modeling, when we are reporting, usually three things go wrong. So one is that the scientists, we never say why we did it. So what were the aims of doing the work that we did, the modeling that we set out to do? And how, so that is really never stated at the very start. We never state why we are doing particular work. And therefore, so nobody can tell whether the model we set out to do actually succeeded or not. And then something else that is very common is that the findings we get are actually lost in the methodology. Many scientists are so keen on detailing the methods and what they did that the results that actually matter get buried under all that technical detail. And someone who's not a clinician, someone who's not a modeler finds it hard to interpret your findings and how to use them. Then thirdly, most of the figures we present check the model, they verify the model, but they do not answer the question that was set out. So most of the plots that are presented, the tables, they are simply checking the model, but few of them show what the findings actually mean. And this is proof. Dijkstra actually and colleagues did a survey where they questioned about more than 300 practitioners, around 351 practitioners surveyed across the different associations, ASAPT, ISOP, and they were asking what is most important in reporting this population pharmacokinetic analysis. And you see that most of them reported that it's the conclusions, it is the summaries you make, it's not about the methods, it's about the takeaway message. What do I take away from the work that you have done? So that is why I'm giving this talk today. How can we better communicate all the work that we've done, the population PK modeling? How can people make decisions, make sense of that? Okay. So what I'm going to talk about, where does it come from? Most of it is already documented heavily. For those in the industry space, they are very well versed with the FDA guidelines and the EMA guidelines. As you see here in blue, these are actually required. You must follow these. So this is not I would like to do or not. That is actually a regulatory requirement if you're submitting to the FDA or the European Medicines Agency. So the rest are simply guidelines, guidances. These are all papers that have been written, and like I've said, I'll reference them all. But what I want to say is that what I'm going to share is not necessarily new, but I'm going to try and bring it together through a bit of experience. But all these are available, like I've said, and you can go and have an in-depth review of those guidelines. So with that said, I'm just going to give a few tips for presenting pop PK work clearly. And the idea behind it all is, I'm going to repeat, is that the audience determines the approach. It determines every figure you should answer. It determines every figure you should use to answer a question, and not just to qualify the model that you used. So I'll walk through them quickly and then we'll go in depth. So again, repetition. Mind the audience and the medium. Is this just a submission to the Food and Drug Authority or the EMA? Is it a paper? Is it a poster presentation? Are you presenting in the clinic to a group of, clinicians, that sort of thing? So And then after you decide who you're presenting to, you need to speak in terms of exposure and not parameters. And we'll see that a lot. As modelers, many times when you're communicating with your work, you've worked with your model so long, you know it in depth, and you find it easy, to talk about things like apparent clearance, apparent volume of distribution. But a clinician who's listening to you during their lunch break, they've come for a journal club meeting, are not going to be bothered about that. They want to know what's the exposure at the end of that day. What's the area under the concentration time curve? What happens? What are you trying to say with your model? Do I need to dose adjust? Do I need to increase the dose, reduce the dose? That is what someone wants something they can act on. Okay. And then it's better to show and not tell. We know that I think people remember about 10% of what they read, about I think 20% of what they uh, I forget, I think it's about 10, 20, but around 80% of what they see is remembered. So make sure that you show your findings. You show, just don't tell them to me, but show it. And we're going to see really good examples on how you can do that. And then again, because modelers are usually using equations, PBPK modeling, PBPK modeling, another tip is for you to draw the model. Draw the model. If the audience you're talking to cannot visualize your model or cannot draw the model back for you, then they didn't understand. So don't just use equations, draw the model. And then stratify on what the decision depends on. We are going to go through that. If your model, if you developed a model on data that was in pediatric population and adult population, is there a difference on how those two should be dosed? Show that difference, stratify, show that your model works for both the pediatric population and both the adult population, or show that it doesn't work in the pediatric vis-a-vis the adults. So you have to stratify based on the decision. Is the decision genotyping that we should dose based on genotype? Then you need to stratify your model based on genotype. Is your decision based on weight? That sort of thing. We're going to look at that. Then focus on the takeaway message. Oftentimes when we're presenting, when you're presenting in a presentation like this, and I've already said, I want you to go away with a message that the audience determines the approach. So when you're presenting, you should focus, what is the takeaway message, as opposed to presenting 20 different things and there is no single message, okay? And then you must say what the model cannot do. Many times limitations actually improve credibility, because it makes your audience know that, look, I understand the limitations of my work. I'm not going to make very superfluous claims. I know the limitations of what I have done. And then lastly, the supplement is not a demotion. This is especially for manuscripts. Many people think, if I put this in the supplement, no one will see it. No, I have seen models where the usable material you had, what you wanted from a publication, was actually the supplement. So a supplement is not a demotion. Okay, so now let's go through them in depth again. So mind the audience. The same analysis can have different jobs. So you have to decide which room you are in before you present your work, okay? For example, if you're presenting to the regulators, FDA, EMA, what they want you to comply with their guidance. So you must comply with their guidance, okay? Which figure should you show? The figure that shows the impact upfront, okay? Then you'll add the full diagnostic plots, for example, in the appendix. But for example, to regulatory submission, you are submitting to reviewers, to assessors, so you must comply with whatever they want. So you might go in as much detail as they want, as much technicality as you want. You must comply. There's no two ways about it. When you're submitting to a journal paper, on the other hand, you're thinking about editors, readers, call them referees, whatever it is, okay? They want something new. What's new about your model? If there are 10 models about vancomycin that have been published, what else are you bringing to the table? And which figure is going to show that newness that you're bringing, okay? For example, is it a covariate figure showing that when you have people who are obese or organ impairment, what's the new thing you're bringing to the table? So you need to be able to bring that out, to express that in in your publication. So what might have been a pivotal figure in the regulatory submission might not necessarily be a pivotal figure in the journal, depending on what you want to communicate. Okay. Then is it a poster or conference talk? You're going to present to peers. Usually at a poster presentation, it's going to take about 3 minutes. I'll walk past your poster, and if I like what I see, I'll be invited to engage further. If I don't like what I see, I'll move further. So you can imagine in a poster, if you put all your table of, your model, chances are I'm not going to be drawn to it. But if you put a really nice figure showing your results or how I can, a really stark figure, maybe this dose vis-a-vis high dose, because what I want is that one message. Oh, I went to a poster presentation, and I really like it. You should go check out that poster. The authors claim that we need to dose adjust for neonates, or we need to dose adjust for teenagers, that sort of thing. So you need a single figure that carries that conclusion. So it's going to be really, you can imagine, like on a poster or at a conference. So you want people to be talking about your work long after the conference. So the technicalities you put in the regulatory submission can't be the same that you use for your poster or for your conference talk, because here you just have peers who probably have 3 minutes, and then if they are not attracted, they won't engage further. Then here, clinicians, these are the prescribers, pharmacists, what they want, the bottom line, how does it affect my patient? What is the dose in milligrams? Is it different for a different patient? So you really need to show exposure distributions. So here is where you think about simulations, this population vis-a-vis that population. If you tell a clinician the exponent on clearance was this and this, it doesn't affect how they practice at all. It doesn't affect their decision. So really for them, you need to show how does it affect exposure or a decision. So that's one. I think you've agreed now that the audience really matters. Two, what you report. A good example is exactly what I've been talking about. Report exposure, not parameters. For example, many modelers say apparent clearance decreased by 0.26 with a creatinine clear exponent of 0.61. That is meaningless to a clinician who needs to practice, okay? It is correct, we can't falsify it, but we can't act on it, okay? So yes, when you report it in a manuscript, the reviewers will find it, it's complete. But to a clinician, it means nothing. To someone, to a regulator, to an ethics review board, it means nothing. Instead, say something like area under the concentration time curve is 34% higher in individuals with severe renal impairment. And then you'll say, okay, 34% higher is a really big increase. So do we need to dose adjust? You can see then how you begin to bring other people into your conversation, how they can begin to appreciate your results. So the first one instead of, so say the second instead of the first. And the FDA also says this, and that is why also the FDA says this as well as journals. Journals these days really encourage you to give an abstract that is in plain text, I mean plain language, so very limited jargon. And as you know, for most people, your work, the only thing they'll ever read is the abstract. Usually they read the abstract. If it's interesting enough, they'll go look for a table and they'll go look for a figure. That's what majority of us, how we read papers. If you're really, really then interested, then you'll go in depth to look for further details. So really, it's better to report exposure. You can imagine if you wrote this sentence in an abstract and I read your abstract, I can't immediately make sense of it. And whereas if I read your abstract and you say AUC is increased by 34%, you're like, okay, that's a big increase in exposure. Or if you say AUC is reduced by 40%, I can go away thinking about how that can affect my patients. Okay, so here is an example. Here is zongatinib. It is used for it's used for lung cancer. And so when they applied to the FDA, they dose according to weight. Okay, so below 90 kilograms, you take 120 milligrams, and above 90 kilograms, you take 180 milligrams or above. So when they are putting in their claim to the FDA, when they were applying, it was very important for them to show a forest plot that is stratified by weight. Okay. And a forest plot simply means you're just comparing, what you're trying to do is compare different individuals, or you're comparing a subgroup to the reference group. So the line you see here, let's say this is the reference group, in this case, a 70-kilogram individual. You can see that's the reference. So the dot is the estimate, the bars are the confidence interval. And so here they're saying, what is the area under the concentration time curve between 0 and 24 hours at steady state when an individual is dosed with 120 milligrams every day? So in this case, they showed that the individuals who were heavier, 120 kilograms, they had about 29% less exposure. And those who are lighter had a larger exposure. And so this is, they applied, presented their work, and then FDA actually reproduced this figure based on what they submitted. They say the forest plot illustrating the relative effects of significant covariates in the final PK model. So the significant covariate was weight, okay? And so when they were presenting their work, they had to stratify it. They had to show a forest plot stratified by weight, the different weight bands, because what they wanted to ask for was weight-based dosing. And so the FDA concluded that based on the PBPK analysis, body weight is the covariate with the greatest effect on exposure. Patients weighing 110 kilograms had an approximately 29% lower AUC compared to those weighing 70 kilograms. And so that was really a nice way to show to FDA and to convince them that, look, we want our drug approved with weight-based dosing. And so this sort of figure is what I wanted to say, that it should sit where the dosing question is answered. So remember what I said, that a figure should answer a question and not just show the model. So of course, the developers of the drug did give all the details about the model, but it was important to show how their model translates into exposure. Okay. Now, another concept I want to highlight is show, don't tell. So when you make a certain sentence that is sort of fact, according to you, it's fact, but what you're doing is you want the audience to trust you. For example, if I make a statement like the model describes the data well, it's how do I double check? How do I cross check that? Okay. Whereas if you show me a visual predictive check with the observed median inside the interval, I can make my own conclusion that indeed the model describes the data well. If you say renal function affected the exposure, can you show me a simulated plot with those who have severe renal impairment, who are normal, have no moderate impairment and severe impairment? Show me that. Do not just make a statement, okay, that renal function affects exposure. How? You say that, but I don't see it, okay? They say none of you ever imagines, none of you ever dreams in words. You always have a figure. When they say your dream car, if I say your dream car right now, you see your dream car, the car you want to drive. If I say blue elephants, you probably think about, now you're seeing a blue elephant. You had never thought about it, but you're thinking a blue elephant. So if you show me as opposed to tell me, it leaves a lasting effect. And if you say the proposed dose is appropriate, I'll show you an example. This is work from a former colleague, and she developed a model in which she fits, this was linezolid, a drug used for treatment of tuberculosis, and she had concentrations, she had time profiles in the plasma and in the cerebrospinal fluid also. So she developed a model, and she wanted to show that at 600 milligrams, so let me first do this. If you look at this horizontal line, it's small, but this is where the star is actually. The horizontal line indicates the minimum inhibitory concentration. And so ideally, you want concentrations of the drug in the cerebrospinal fluid to be above that threshold. And so using her model, she was able to show that, look, in the plasma, we have concentrations way above that MIC, okay, at 600 milligrams. But in the cerebrospinal fluid, they are just barely over. Whereas when you buff the dose up to 1,200 milligrams, now you begin to see the cerebrospinal fluid concentration marginally, much higher than the minimum inhibitory concentration. So she could have probably written this in words to just say 1,200 milligrams achieves reasonably acceptable concentrations in the CSF fluid. But when you see it, even a clinician can make their own judgment. You're like, when we dose 600 milligrams, it doesn't really get there. But when we dose 1,200 milligrams, it gets there. Okay, so these are simulations. So you have your model, you simulate, you show us in terms of exposure. And so that is a clear example of show, don't tell. Another example is for show, don't tell is when you have different, this is isoniazid, a drug, it's metabolized, it's acetylated by NAT2. Katrina, sorry, where did you lose me?
Yes, I also disconnected, so I wasn't sure if it was you or me.
Yeah.
No, Eric, I think hopefully you can hear us now talking. I think we had a general Ugandan internet.
Looks like
Okay,
we're
can you
right
hear
in
me
the chat.
now?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine. Maybe just in case it happens again, we can turn off your video for now.
Okay.
Just to save some internet, and then if you look at the slide, they'll tell you exactly where you were.
Okay. So can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay. So I believe I was at this slide. Okay.
Yes,
Katrina,
you are.
please confirm that. Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, so I was just saying that here is another example of show, don't tell. And just to say that if you showed this to a clinician, for example, these are individuals who are rapid metabolizers of the drug of isoniazid. These are individuals who are intermediate metabolizers in the red, and these are individuals who are slow metabolizers. So with such a plot, it might be easier to convince a clinician that, look, we need to genotype our individuals. So we find out if they are slow, rapid, or intermediate metabolizers. And you can see if we assumed non-linear dose exposure, what happens, or if you assume a linear dose exposure, you can see that difference with whatever model is assumed. Here is another example just to show that sometimes what you use doesn't have to be fancy at all. You may have, this is a study in which you are showing where your PD, where your biomarker. In this case, they were looking at erythrocyte mean corpuscular hemoglobin in femtomoles. And you can see at baseline, at week 2, at week 4, and you're trying to show placebo vis-a-vis those who are given a low dose, vis-a-vis those who are given a high dose. You can see the number of individuals, and you can see that across the board, really nothing changed in terms of whether it was a placebo, low dose, high dose. So even just a figure like that can make you point and say, look, there's no difference depending on the dosages you give. That difference is whether you take it's at baseline week 2, week 4. So what I want to say here is that your presentation of your results or your work do not have to be fancy. Sometimes it can be as simple as that. Something else that modelers forget, which is very important, is the designs that they use. In the methods, they take quite a bit of time explaining what the study design was, but sometimes the study design is very complex. I'll share an example here. This is work we did previously where we sampled a mother. We took both blood and breast milk samples. We also sampled the infant and we took a heel prick sample. And we did this on 2 PK visits. So you can imagine that if you were to write this down, if you were to add this study design to your poster presentation or to a 15-minute talk, you would spend a lot of time explaining it. So sometimes we want to understand you're sharing results, but where do they come from? What was the study design like? And so just a schematic like this is very easy. It's interpretable, and we can easily follow. Another example here about the study design is when you have complex study designs from which you're drawing your PK data. You want to show that patients who are recruited, maybe they started treatment. This is especially important when you have several visits at which you took PK, some of them being sparse, some of them being intense, at 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months. It just really helps you to show. I mean, you can describe all this in words, but like I've said, sometimes you're just talking to colleagues at lunchtime and you want to convince them and you want to tell them in a nutshell where your information, where you study, where you got your data from. Lastly, about show, don't tell. This is oftentimes we have pooled analysis. This is part of, this was my previous work when I was still at University of Cape Town that was part of my PhD, and I pulled several studies. And so the question often is whether it's a regulatory board or a reviewer, you're writing a publication. They want to know you pulled data from 6 studies. Should you have pulled it? Should you not have pulled it? What was the difference in populations? What was the difference in dosages? So you can see here that I talked about the radio study. I showed how individuals were on dolutegravir, 50 milligrams. Then at week 2, they buffed up to 100 milligrams. Then they took a break, but in that break, they introduced rifampicin, and I show exactly where we did the sampling. Whereas another study, it was 50 milligrams once daily. Then instead of 100 milligrams once daily, it's now twice daily. So it's very easy to see why I pulled those 6 studies together. So sometimes you have studies which are sparse, which are intense, and communicating them without a figure, just in words, can be quite confusing. This is what I said in the beginning. Draw your models, not just the equations. Like I've said, there are individuals who are less less mathematical in the way they think. And so instead of writing your equations, the differential equations do not tell the audience what the model assumes. Whereas if I show you a figure, you'll see what I assumed in a minute. And also use plain language. For example, you might say apparent clearance is how fast the body removes the drug, and this is the symbol I'm going to use, and then use it throughout. You can show us clearly where some of your covariates act, okay, by using an arrow or pointing, and then keep a similar theme throughout. For example, if you have placebo subjects and you use red somewhere for them, make sure it's red throughout. And then if those who are treated were blue, make sure you use a blue theme throughout. You can imagine if for your publication, placebos were red in one figure and then blue in another, and then in another figure they switch. It's a bit confusing. And so really the takeaway is that if the model can't draw if the audience can't draw your model back to you, then they can't judge what you assumed. So I'm going to give you an example of model schema. These are different examples. This is just to show you what is possible. The use of infographics is very helpful now. The use of AI to help you draw your models. And this, I developed this really in PowerPoint, really, just this was a model on tenofovir. I was just highlighting that there are different prodrugs, TAF, TDF, the details are not important. And these were different equations. So if I wrote this down in terms of equations, it would be very difficult for some people to interpret. But if you show it on a schema like this, you're like, oh, okay, I see what's happening there. This is another example. You give the dose, it goes through several compartments, transit compartments, gets to the gut, is absorbed to the liver. There's a fraction that's removed by first pass. We take off a blood sample from your central compartment. It's easy for someone to think, and it will also be easier for someone to interpret your mathematical equations. Again, here it's just to show you what can be. You can make them as fancy as you want. You can make them as, really, it's up to you. Here, we're trying to show that the drug goes into the gut. We observe it in the plasma, but we also take off some breast milk, and we have some observations of the breast milk, and we're trying to, model that. And so we fitted, we added two parameters, an equilibrium rate constant and an accumulation factor. Lastly, stratify. What does your decision depend on? For example, I showed earlier about dose, 600 milligrams vis-a-vis 1,200 milligrams. I've shown you about a different prodrug, a different formulation. So whatever you want to show, whatever point you want to make sure you stratify by that decision. Okay? So, for example, the FDA says that goodness of fit plots stratified by important patient characteristics or the trial design are often more convincing and adequate as opposed to pulling that data together, as opposed to presenting everything together. So these are just a few examples of what you can stratify on. For example, I've shown you an example of genotype or SIP status. I've shown you that the studies can be different and therefore the populations are different. But make sure whenever you present your work, you ought to do it by stratifying your findings. What's the important decision that needs to be made? I'll give you an example. This is the previous infographic I showed you here. I modeled tenofovir. And really, the exposure was different. The concentrations are different based on the prodrug you took. Okay, so this is just a visual predictive check, and want to see that the observations, which are the circles, the median observations, fall within the predicted interval. So you can see I showed tenofovir here when you swallowed TDF. So TDF is a prodrug for tenofovir. And here is when you've swallowed TAF. So you can imagine if I didn't stratify this data and I tried to simply plot one figure, it would show that my model is not adequate to describe either of the data. But the moment I stratify it, you can now see that my model describes this data quite well as this data will. So please stratify. I'll take you back to the zongatinib example. Remember, for them, they said what was important was weight. So they showed in their report, they showed visual predictive checks by weight. So less than or equal to 50 kilograms, that band, between 50 to 70 kilograms, another band, 70 to 90 kilograms, and then above 90 kilograms. You can see that the exposure keeps on decreasing. The heavier you get, but nevertheless, the model still captures the trend well. And therefore, with this, they can justify that it is better it's better to dose based on weight. excuse me, in your presentations, you ought to focus on the takeaway message. Many times we present plots and we say conditional weighted residues versus time plot. So we present work and really the titles we give are simply axis labels. I can call them axis label title. You give a title where there's no message in the title. But instead of just saying conditional weighted residues versus time, the take-home message should be that there's no time-dependent bias in my model, maybe from 0 to 24 hours in any dose group. You can say that the final VPC, this is the final VPC of the model, or you can better say that model reproduces the observed 5th and 95th percentiles of the data. You saw an example of the forest plot where you can make a judgment call, something like only renal function shifts AUC beyond a particular reference band. So you have to think, if you can't write a takeaway message in one sentence, the figure probably belongs to the supplement. If you need to overtly comment and add so many footnotes, if you need a lot of wording to interpret a figure, it's probably not. You probably need to work on it a bit or improve it. A figure should be able to stand alone and really give a key message. Lastly, as I bring this to a close, say what the model can't do. Limitations buy credibility rather than cost it. In a paper, in a submission, if you tell me your limitations up front, that means you're answering a question on your own terms, okay? Whereas if you don't tell me your limitations, a reviewer might ask you questions on their own terms. So examples are a covariate range and balance. Let me say you had creatinine clearance only between 65 and 130. You didn't have. So if that's the only information you have, you probably can't make a good judgment call about people who are severely impaired, okay? So you need to tell us what's the distribution? What did you observe? If you had data only within this dose range, is it okay for you to extrapolate to another dose range, yet you didn't have any observations there? So are you able to extrapolate outside the studied range? And if so, what are the assumptions you make? So tell us the limitations of what your model can do. And what assumptions does it depend on? Does it depend on some linear relationship? Does it depend on, on handling the data which is below limit of quantification in certain way? What are the assumptions that your model depends on, and what might happen if those assumptions break or if they are changed? And how does your work or your model, excuse me, how does it agree with other studies in other populations? What are the differences in other populations and other published studies? A key example is how shrinkage hides a covariant relationship. So this often happens when we have sparse sampling. So within an individual, you have very few samples per individual, whereas rich sampling, you have a lot of samples per an individual. So oftentimes when we as modelers report our effects or our findings, we forget to report shrinkage. If the shrinkage is low, the post hoc empirical based estimates are more robust than if you have sparse sampling. So it doesn't mean when you have sparse sampling, your model is. It doesn't mean when you have high shrinkage, you discard the model. This is just an example of something that is common and that is sometimes not reported, but that shrinkage should be reported whenever you're giving us whenever you're talking about post hoc estimates. Lastly, the supplement is not a demotion. This is what I said. Try as much as possible. Whatever cannot fit in the main text, you can add it to the supplement. So every conclusion must be reproducible by someone else from the code and the data you've shared. So think about what is your main text vis-a-vis what is in the supplement. You might be surprised that for a particular audience, what you want to put in the supplement for another audience might actually be the main text for a particular audience. So just make sure that when you have a presentation, for example, instead of a supplement, you can always have extra slides. And if a question is raised after your presentation, you can always refer to those extra slides. So if you have more time, you look at the content of the supplement. They can be your extra slides or can put them in the supplement, excuse me. So I invite you to reflect on your own presentations as I close. These are the questions you need to answer when you put forward a presentation. Why did you do the analysis? What information did you use? How did you do that analysis? What did you find and why does it matter? So is the model good enough for you to make those assumptions? And what are the key assumptions and limitations of that model? So this can be a pre-flight check really for your slides or for your manuscript or for your talk, where you look at every section and every figure and say, who is this section aimed at? Is it for a regulator? Is it for a reviewer? And the claims I make, are they supported by a figure? For example, do I just assert or do I support this with a figure? Then do the covariate effects show impact on exposure or concentrations? Do I have a model schema? Are my diagnostics stratified by the decision that I want to make, by the variable that the decision depends on? Have I provided records, control streams, and have I talked about the limitations of my work? Not just a generic caveat, but in particular, this work, what are the limitations? Lastly, here is the references that I've used throughout. I've tried to group them into some of the regulatory aspects, reporting and communicating, figures and diagnostics, and covariates and visualization. And with that, I'd like to, this slide highlights the colleagues I work with and those I've worked with over the years, because a lot of this has been collaborative work at, different stages of my modeling journey. So with that, I'd like to thank you and hand over to the chair.
Wonderful, thank you. And I hope my connection is still stable. I believe it's been a little bit of a regional problem this afternoon. That was beautiful, Ida. I feel like every time, even though I've heard you present on numerous occasions, every time I hear you present, I learn something new. And I'm enjoying some of the comments. Innocent Asimwe has commented that a key takeaway for him so far was the show, don't tell. But he does ask the question of how far this principle should be taken. Should it apply to every slide? For example, when you discussed the framework, point 4 was draw the model and not only the equations. He wondered whether the framework slide itself could also be presented visually, maybe using a diagram or an illustration rather than mainly bullet points. So, Innocent, of course, you can also unmute yourself if you wish to expand on that. Ida, how would you respond?
Yeah, I've always said, in my opinion, anything that can be made into a figure, into an infographic, in a more digestible manner should be put forward as such. Because it really is easier to remember. It's many times I've seen colleagues quote, if you remember when you've quoted someone's work or referenced someone's work in a presentation, you almost always reference a figure or a table. Rarely do you reference text. Rarely do you show text, We're always picking figures and tables from other literature. So I would say yes, if you can make it into an infographic, it's a lot It's quicker. We're going into the era where presentations are becoming ever shorter. So you have a 10-minute presentation, 15-minute presentation. So whatever makes your communication better, I'd recommend that.
Feel it also, those diagrams for the methods actually often help us preempt questions. And sometimes when we're making those diagrams, we realize that we ourselves don't understand it quite as well as we should. And so I often feel that if you can actually present something diagrammatically, you've really digested it and can communicate it well.
Yeah, that's true, Katrina. So many times when I've been asked to model, and this helps me because sometimes you try one model vis-a-vis another model vis-a-vis another model, and oftentimes a diagram helps you to understand, okay, what was the difference between that model and this model? Which arrow did I change? Which equation did I remove? Which equation did I add to? So it also helps you have just a pictorial of the changes you made as opposed to just flipping around the equation. And like you've said, so many times it helps you internalize what exactly am I doing and what does that mean?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Right. So, sorry, Innocent, on you go.
No, thanks a lot. Just wanted to add one last point. So I used to hate graphical abstracts, but I think to articles I was forced to make graphical abstracts, and I learned a lot from them because it forces you to what? Because it's to put all your study in just one image. So you realize
Yeah,
probably some aspects were not being communicated well. Maybe you need to simplify some things. Now, for all papers, even if I'm not required to put a graphical abstract, I try to create one so that it also helps you to better understand what you did.
exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Hadija is asking that most times we set out to do a PKPD model in a certain population to describe it. In that case, what would be the best way to pinpoint what you're looking for? Do you get that question, or do we need to ask Hadija to expand a little?
Hadida, I don't fully get your question, but I think this is what you're talking about. So very early on, as I said at the beginning, that many of us, you set out to do a model, but it's important for you yourself to understand, I think it's uh, what's the aim of that analysis? What's the aim of that modeling exercise? Is it just descriptive? Is it for me to just describe the data I've seen? If it's just for you to describe the profiles you've seen, well and good. But are you needing to describe those profiles, come up with a model, and then use that model to maybe extrapolate to a different population? Are you using that model to interpolate what might maybe you observed at doses between maybe you have data coming from a 500 milligram dose and a 2000 milligram dose, and you want to see what a 1000 milligram dose would look like. So even for you, it is important to understand why you're doing the analysis. Is it just descriptive? Is it going to be used to answer a particular question? And once you understand that, you'll have an idea about how to design the study, to collect the data, or if you already have that data, you'll begin to look at, you'll begin to, you'll have an idea of what the data can help you answer or not. For example, if you have very sparse data, can you make any inferences on the peak? There are some, what I'm trying to say is you need to understand why you're doing the analysis from the get-go. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I can see that Akshita has asked a slightly similar question or an overlapping question. Firstly, complimenting you on an incredible webinar, but also wanting to ask how we decide which model is best suited for our data, or which one is the right one to choose or apply.
Again, I think modeling is an art and a science. There's no right or wrong. There's the adage that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think it goes back to what I said. What do you want to use your model for? Some models will help you answer some questions. Some models will not be able to answer some questions based on the data you have. For example, if you have a model in adults, can it help you answer a question about dosing in pediatrics? Maybe, depending on various things. You can extend this model, you can decide to use a PBPK model, so there are all sorts of different things, but the end of the day is you must know why am I modeling and what do I hope to answer? That can help you choose. You see, that can help you choose if the model is adequate to answer the question I want. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Sharon Sawe has asked whether you have a strategy for how you communicate the limitations in a way that is transparent but still demonstrates the value and robustness of the model. For example, which limitations affect interpretation and which are simply the realities of clinical data. And Innocent has added on, if you're tailoring a presentation to the audience, how do you decide which limitations to include? Should they all be disclosed for transparency or only those relevant to that audience? Great questions, Ida.
I'd say what is relevant to the audience. So for a non-technical team, non-technical audience, I'm going to give you an example. We usually have data that is below the limit of quantitation. And there are several methods to handle that data, because if you handle it poorly, it can skew your findings, your results. Telling clinicians or people in the regulatory, as a review board, how you handled data below the limit of quantitation might not be really helpful because they don't know that nitty-gritty. But telling clinicians that you have a small sample size and that you only had 3 individuals who are rapid metabolizers vis-a-vis 40 who are slow metabolizers vis-a-vis 80 who are intermediate is relevant, because you're trying to tell them that there's a difference in exposure based on phenotype. And that's what you're trying to say. And then you say a disclaimer, by the way, we only had 4 individuals. So that is relevant to the clinicians. Whereas telling them how you handled BLQ data is neither here nor there. But for a technical team who want to understand if your model was robust, they might need to understand how much data you threw away. Did you throw away 10% of your data? What did you do? So I think even the limitations can be audience specific. And then to Sharon, one of the things I always try to do is data. The data on which you fitted a model, that is always relevant. Was it intense? Was it sparse? Was it in a particular demographic? Was it in a particular race alone? Especially if you're going to make conclusions about, especially if you want it to be generalizable. You're going to say, this was only in pregnant women, this was only in Caucasians, this was only in neonates. So one of the things I always think about a limitation is talking about your data. How much of it do you have? Where did it come from? Was it intense? Was it sparse? I think most of the limitations come from that aspect. And then the rest are more details, handling BLQ, the assumptions you make. But all those assumptions you make are really based on what your data looks like. Because all the assumptions you make really mostly are to fit the data better, to describe it better, to get the model to run. And the root of many of those are your model, are that data, how you sampled, when it was sampled, what dose was taken, what population range it was. I had only healthy volunteers, not patients. So that's where most of the limitations, in my opinion, usually come from. The math is usually sound and robust. Yeah.
And sometimes some audiences don't want to know all the detail of the limitations. And I think as scientists, we tend to be very, very honest. But sometimes when we're talking with policymakers, they almost want the top line. Now, I'm afraid time is drawn to a close. Francis Ojara, I did see you raise your hand, and I'm sorry we didn't quite get to you. A couple of people have asked about the recording, and The answer to that question is in the chat. It will be available tomorrow from the Pharmacometrics Africa website. Somebody else has asked where they could get some basically materials and information on where to get started. I would start with the Pharmacometrics Africa website. There's some different materials available there. You can reach out to any of us. We're always happy to try and provide guidance and point you in the right direction. And we're delighted to perhaps be able to signpost you. Thank you to our diverse audience. I can see that many of you have been online throughout. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope it whets your appetite for next time. It's quite clear, Aida, that time wasn't enough today, so we will probably continue on this topic at some point. Thank you very much.